Thank you for tuning in to this presentation. I'm Xiao, and I'm presenting our research on the regulation of video games. Specifically, we are focusing on loot boxes, a potentially harmful gambling-like randomized monetization method found in video games, which no doubt most of you are familiar with. So exactly what is a loot box? Although most of you will have some idea of this already, I will start by setting out the way that we define loot boxes for the purpose of our research. Loot boxes are virtual consumable items in video games that can be opened by players to obtain randomized rewards of varying in-game and real-world value. They come in many different virtual forms: treasure chests, car packs, prize wheels, or gacha machines, and they appear in a lot of popular games, such as the character summoning system of Genshin Impact, a Chinese game that is popular across the world. Our research focuses on paid loot boxes that can be bought for real-world money. These appear to be the most harmful as they can directly cause overspending of real-world money by players. Some games allow loot box rewards to be traded between players, which can allow players to sell in-game items for real-world money. This means that these loot box rewards gain real-world monetary value. So what can loot box rewards do? Some rewards are purely cosmetic. For example, they may make your weapon glow pink instead of blue, or give you gold rather than silver armor. Other rewards actually influence gameplay. They could unlock additional content, for example, allowing the player to play as a different character with different abilities, or to give the player a competitive advantage over other players, such as more powerful weapons. This means that players who paid for loot boxes can become stronger than other players, which could potentially encourage other players to also buy loot boxes so that they can catch up and compete on a more equal footing. So there may be a stronger incentive to buy loot boxes, which give a competitive advantage than those which are simply cosmetic. How much do players spend on loot boxes? We don't have conclusive data on worldwide loot box spending because this data is held by game companies and they don't release their loot box sales data to the public. In China, however, video game companies are legally required to publicly disclose the results of all loot box openings. This has led to the loot box purchasing histories of some games to become available as public data. We've been able to figure out that just one single game, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, or CSGO, generates over $500,000 or 3 million renminbi per day in China alone. So worldwide spending on loot boxes is clearly substantial. Some extreme cases of individual players' loot box spending have been reported in mainstream media, such as one UK player spending around £700 in 1 month. Another player spent over $10,000 in 2 years on the loot boxes of one single game. The BBC also reported in 2019 on a case where 4 children spent around the equivalent of £550 of their father's money on loot boxes without permission and still didn't get the rare item they were after. And so what are the potential harms of loot boxes? Firstly, they're structurally similar to gambling. Both loot boxes and traditional gambling involve the player or gambler paying an amount of money with the hope of obtaining something more valuable or more money through a randomized process. Empirical evidence has consistently established that there is a relationship between loot box spending and problem gambling. Specifically, that the more severe that participants' self-reported problem gambling was, the more money they spent on loot boxes. Although I will add that we don't yet know whether loot boxes cause people to become problem gamblers, or if people who are already problem gamblers are more likely to spend a lot of money on loot boxes. Loot boxes are now a common sight across all major video game platforms. Many researchers are particularly concerned about children and other vulnerable groups being exposed to loot boxes. The UK Gambling Commission has, for example, found that 23% of UK 11 to 16-year-olds have paid real money to buy loot boxes. Previous research on loot box prevalence in the UK found that 59% of the 100 highest grossing iPhone games contain loot boxes, and that almost the same percentage of games which were specifically deemed suitable for children also contain loot boxes. Prompted by backlash from player communities, as well as perhaps ethical, legal, or PR concerns, some video game companies have stopped implementing loot boxes in their games. So we considered whether the bad reputation of loot boxes amongst player communities might have caused the loot box prevalence rate in 2021 to be lower than the rate previously found in 2019, given that there have been media reports of some companies no longer implementing these mechanics. Different policy approaches have been taken in different countries in relation to loot boxes. For example, in Belgium, all implementations of loot boxes are deemed to be gambling, and so they are effectively banned if the company does not have a gambling license, which none of the video companies reportedly have. In contrast, most paid loot boxes in the UK are not legally recognized as gambling, and so they remain unregulated. We're expecting a white paper setting out the UK government's regulatory plans, if any, on this issue in the coming months. And so how can loot boxes be regulated? There are several potential ways to do this, and restricting players from purchasing loot boxes, in other words, an outright ban, is only one of many different potential approaches. Another less restrictive approach that retains players' autonomy to purchase loot boxes and preserve video game companies' existing commercial interests has been adopted as law in China. This law requires companies to disclose the exact probabilities of obtaining the potential rewards from their loot boxes. This measure is arguably borrowed from the gambling harm reduction literature, but what does this measure mean in practice for video games? So here we have two examples of probability disclosures shown as screenshots from video games. On the left, we can see that if we bought this loot box, we would have a 4.61% chance of obtaining an elite tier hero, the rarest category of rewards available. On the right, we can see probabilities disclosed for specific items. For example, the player has a 1% chance of obtaining Mario in his happy outfit. So why are probability disclosures helpful? They could give players a better idea of how many loot boxes they might need to buy before they are able to obtain the rare rewards that they can get. And the probability disclosures also help to illustrate just how low the player's chances of getting some of the rarest rewards really are. This is where the title of our paper comes in. What are the odds? As I mentioned, China is currently the only country to require loot box probability disclosures by law. Worldwide, however, video game companies have adopted this measure as a form of industry self-regulation. For example, Apple and Google require probability disclosures for all games on their respective app stores. The law generally has a greater enforcement power in the sense that non-compliant companies could be fined. In contrast, industry self-regulation is generally voluntary. Non-compliant companies face no negative consequences. This raises the question, is legal regulation more effective than industry self-regulation in this context? If industry self-regulation is just as effective, then there is no need for other countries to introduce laws such as the one adopted in China. But if industry self-regulation is less effective, then other countries should also consider adopting this measure as a law to improve the compliance rate in the interest of consumer protection. With these questions in mind, we assess loot box prevalence and compliance rate with industry self-regulation for the 100 highest grossing iPhone games in the UK, and compared our results with Zando's 2019 UK findings and our own previous 2020 Chinese findings. In 2019, the UK loot box prevalence rate was observed to be at 59%. We hypothesized that because some companies have decided to stop implementing loot boxes, the prevalence rate will now be statistically significantly lower. However, we actually found loot boxes to be present in 77% of the 100 highest grossing UK iPhone games. This was statistically significantly higher than the 59% found 2 years ago. This suggests that at least on the mobile games market, the loot box prevalence rate has not decreased and has actually increased. Children and adults alike are now more likely to be exposed to loot boxes than they were in 2019. However, quite importantly, despite this increase, the loot box prevalence rate that we found in 2020 in China was 91%. So loot boxes are still very much more popular in China and probably other Far East Asian countries than in Western countries. Previously, we assessed the loot box probability disclosure rate of the 100 highest grossing iPhone games in mainland China in 2020. We found that 95.6% of games containing loot boxes disclosed probabilities. However, the disclosure rate that we found in the UK was only 64%. This was statistically significantly lower than the Chinese compliance rate. This means that at least in the loot box probability disclosures context, voluntary self-regulation is less effective than the law at ensuring compliance. In countries where industry self-regulation has already been adopted, such as the UK, probability disclosures should still be required by law to increase the compliance rate and actually provide the level of consumer protection that has been promised to video game players. This doesn't mean that industry self-regulation is completely useless. In fact, there are many potential benefits. An industry self-regulator is much better able to understand the technical aspects of video game design and respond more quickly and more cost-effectively to new industry developments and to any instances of non-compliance, whereas the law is often incredibly slow in adapting to novel issues. What the industry self-regulation we've looked at so far is missing is enforcement powers. Apple and Google don't appear to punish companies for breaking their self-regulations by not making probability disclosures, but it's possible for industry self-regulation to get stricter. Through contractual terms, self-regulators such as app stores could impose and enforce private law punishments. App stores can delist non-compliant games, disable in-app purchase features, and even freeze funds and delay the transfer of revenue generated by the game's previous month's sales. In the face of such threats, video game companies would be far more likely to do what they promised to do and disclose probabilities to their players. We can look at the example of South Korea's industry self-regulation. This has better enforcement powers than the Apple and Google app stores and reported a compliance rate of 90.8% in August 2021, much higher than the 64% found in the UK and closer to the 95.6% disclosure rate found under Chinese law. One other point worth noting, our study and the imposition of loot box probability disclosure requirements proceeded on the assumption that probability disclosures reduce spending, and therefore including them will help players to make more informed purchasing decisions. However, is that even true? Research from other risk communication domains would suggest that a lot of people would not be able to understand the probability disclosures, and children especially will struggle to benefit. In a separate survey, we asked Chinese video game players whether they have seen probability disclosures in video games that they play. Of 428 participants who self-reported having purchased loot boxes in the past 12 months, 84.6% reported having seen probability disclosures. This reflects that most loot box purchasers have in fact seen probability disclosures despite them being implemented through suboptimal methods. Does seeing the disclosure reduce spending? To answer this, we asked whether players bought fewer loot boxes and spent less money after seeing probability disclosures. Of 362 loot box purchasers who saw probability disclosures, 72.4% reported that their loot box purchasing behavior has not been affected by probability disclosures, and only 19.3% reported buying fewer loot boxes and spending less money. Now, what does these survey results tell us? Taken together, of all 428 loot box purchasers, only 16.4% reported buying fewer loot boxes and spending less money after seeing probability disclosures. This suggests that even if loot box probability disclosures are implemented prominently, their effectiveness at reducing spending is limited. A more interventionist measure, rather than probability disclosures, may be necessary to effectively reduce spending and minimize harms. Regulators should also consider those other stronger measures, such as imposing maximum spending limits to ensure consumer protection. Finally, I would just like to say that the existing research on loot boxes have proceeded without collaborations with the video game industry. Video game companies are in possession of data on how players spend money on loot boxes. With that data, we can much better understand the prevalence and extent of loot box harms. By working together with the industry, we have a more scientific understanding of loot boxes that can better guide evidence-informed regulation. Importantly, by working together, we can all help players to have a better and safer experience. So I would ask anyone who might have access to or is able to negotiate access to loot box spending data with video game companies to please get in touch with me. Thank you very much for listening. I will take questions now, but if you have any further questions after the Q&A session, please feel free to get in touch with me using any of these methods. Thank you.